I don't like buses. I spent a disproportionate amount of time on buses over the past few years. I don't have a car, so buses are the only way I can get around. And I've spent a large portion of my life sitting in a bus seat. But that doesn't mean I like them. In particular, I really don't like school buses at all. The first time I ever experienced racism, I made eye contact with this kid I had never seen, never talked to before in my life. And he got up out of his seat. He said to me, "You're a chink. You're a yellow piece of human dog shit, and you'll never amount to anything in life. Your mother is a slut, your father is a whore, and that's all you will ever be. A piece of shit. A stupid fucking Asian bitch. You're too weak to play football or lacrosse. You're too dumb to join chess club or math club. And you'll never be anything. Ever. This is you. That's what you look like." My first instinct was to cry, which I did for a very long time. Very, very long time. But after that passed, I actually started asking myself, where did the hate in his eyes come from? It seemed like he treated me the way you would treat someone you were at war with, the way you would treat an enemy. And it certainly didn't have anything to do with me. Sure, there's talks of transgenerational trauma coming down from people who experience horrible events being passed down to their children, their grandchildren. So maybe the same was true for the people who exert that trauma, for the people who do those things to those people. That got me thinking, what did his ancestors do to my ancestors when we were actually at war? What was it like to live in this country and look like the enemy?
I wanted to learn just how far back this racism went, so I did some research. I found that the normalization of casual racism and discrimination against the Japanese began before the United States was even involved in World War II. Racist comics, skewed reporting, and a general disdain towards people who looked different fueled the transition of intolerance into everyday conversation. Contrary to opinions claiming that Pearl Harbor was responsible for the backlash against the Japanese, there were clear discriminatory precedents in the United States history.
There was anti-Chinese agitation. They were run out of Tacoma. Many of them, there was a lynching in California. They couldn't bring the Chinese back for cheap labor, so they brought in Japanese. And so the Japanese inherited that same anti-Chinese, anti-Asian, yellow peril kind of feelings.
The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 brought the idea of discrimination against Asians into the mainstream. The Asian Exclusion Act of 1924 completely banned the immigration of Asians.
I mean, there's very normalized and rampant discrimination towards Japanese Americans, immigrants, or their children.
By the time World War II began, Asians were already the enemy, subhuman and alien. All that was needed was the final straw, one last push that would justify any injustices conducted in the name of revenge.
From the NBC newsroom in New York, President Roosevelt said in a statement today that the Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, from the air.
They are called Nisei. They are Americans. Most are American citizens by birth. There is no proven guilt, not even a proven military need. Yet respected public officials, the Army, the President of the United States, unite to imprison these fellow Americans without trial or hearing, and the Supreme Court approves.
On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, forcing 120,000 people of Japanese heritage into American concentration camps throughout the West.
All Japanese, whether you're American citizens or not, have to go to camp.
Being 13 years old, I said to myself, I was born in the U.S. and I'm an American citizen. And how could they do that to me?
You are just almost like an outsider. We were treated like foreigners in our own country.
They had to abandon most of their possessions and properties, bringing only what they could carry in their arms.
My parents had a grocery store, and they had only 7 days to pack up everything or sell it for almost nothing.
So we took all the clothes that we could take, and then we wore a skirt or pants underneath, so that we wore a couple, 3 things, so that we could have more. They said, you have to go, so we just went.
Some Japanese citizens, hoping to prove their loyalty as Americans, volunteered to join the 442nd, a unit famed and highly decorated during World War II for carrying out highly dangerous missions.
For some of the older people, like 18 or 19, it was a place where they had to confront the issue of, should I volunteer and fight for America? And some said yes, and some said no.
They know what they're fighting against, and they know what they're fighting for.
There's a very strong sense of we need to prove our loyalty by going along with this and being as patriotic and as American as possible, which you see in terms of the 442nd Regiment and also even the JACL, the Japanese American Citizens League, their stance encouraging people to follow along with the executive order.
Attitudes within the camps remained mixed. To the American public, the concentration camps were advertised as a symptom of war, with smiling Japanese citizens praising their American opportunities.
And finding satisfaction in becoming self-supporting once more.
Regardless of the image presented to the rest of the world, 120,000 Japanese American citizens remained confined in the camps for the next 3 years. Outside the camps, racism against Japanese people was widespread and accepted. Publications released vicious illustrations of scheming Japanese villains. Posters calling for the purchase of war bonds in order to push back the evil rising sun were on every bulletin board. Life magazine, following the trend, published a slurry of now offensive anti-Japanese content in efforts to boost war morale. The cartoons and the ideas they reinforced worked so well to incite anger and fear in American citizens that they actually had to include a guide in one of their issues differentiating between Chinese and Japanese people. Unfortunately, it didn't work so well in practice.
They'd say bad things about being a Jap or something like that, or even Chink, you know. Everybody, white people or black people, they comment on your discriminating. And you can't get away from it, even today.
In January of 1945, the final camp was shut down, and the last group of incarcerated Japanese citizens was released. But the world they came back to was drastically different from the one they were initially sealed off from. For starters, they had nothing. Most goods and properties owned by Japanese citizens were either auctioned off, ransacked, or bought for dirt cheap.
I think it was more traumatic for our parents who had to give up their businesses.
But my family was forced to leave their home. So of course when they came back, it had already been rented to somebody else. So they lost their home.
My father was an independent grocer before the war. He and the other Japanese grocers got together and made a co-op. So he was a very successful businessman. The war started, Pearl Harbor, and his clientele, mostly white clients, stopped coming. And so he knew right away his business was over. My father really lost his identity and could not recoup it. The only job he could get was a janitor's job, and they lived in a basement.
The anguish of being released from camp without the opportunity to regain their work and their sense of purpose, it led some of them to commit suicide.
To make matters worse, despite their having done nothing besides stay confined behind fences for 3 years, the image of an evil, conniving Japanese enemy was still very fresh in the minds of many Americans.
Discrimination towards people of Japanese descent was very normalized. If you look at that cartoon by Dr. Seuss, you realize just how acceptable it is to hate Japanese and Japanese Americans and suspect them of being, traitors, even though no Japanese American was ever found guilty of treason.
There are actually at least two different Americas, and we lived in the one with less justice. We lived in the one where the Pledge of Allegiance didn't apply to us.
We wouldn't go to places where we thought we might be treated differently.
Just because we looked like the enemy.
My mother used to say, they sent us to this camp and we did not want to go. And when the war was over, they sent us home, but we had nowhere to go.
The trauma from being imprisoned simply because of their race became a theme in Nisei families, passed down in one form or another as shame, guilt, or even mental illness.
When you're a victim like that, oftentimes you just are silent. You don't want to say anything because you think you deserved it or you think you brought it on yourself. Either that or you go into denial. It didn't happen or it wasn't that bad.
I guess we just went along with the parents and we didn't have any discrimination.
I myself didn't feel the antagonism.
I don't know that they were racist. I didn't think so. I mean, there's no reason for them to.
It's been likened to the impact of rape survivors, where they feel like they're responsible for something that happened to them that truly has nothing to do with them. It's not their fault at all.
It was a betrayal by your own government of your citizenship. Your own government turned against you and threw you in jail because of your race. We didn't look like the enemy because there were Germans, Americans who looked like the enemy. General Eisenhower, who became president, looked like the enemy. And we looked like an enemy, yes, but because of all the other agitation, we became the enemy.
When you don't see those kind of patterns in history, see that kind of repetition, it's hard to understand the signs.
You ask, can it happen again? Well, the factors are there, the mechanisms are there, and it was done by an executive order.
In the face of history repeating itself, the need to speak out against greed, propaganda, and hysteria is clearer than ever.
If you choose to participate, that is your choice, but you cannot claim ignorance.
So if you want to be a good ally to someone, ask them, how can I be a good ally?
If you cannot go out and march, and if that's not your thing, go contribute to the ACLU, who will march for you.
I think in modern times, the overwhelming view is that this was a horrible injustice. But at the same time, we still have to keep teaching people about it, because otherwise, we could be headed down a dark path again.
As Japanese, we were the first taken. It's our legacy to stand should any other group be taken. And so we should be the first to stand. We should be the first to protest. And by me telling the story to people, and they hear it, they get a piece of that legacy.
I would never have imagined that 70 years later, after the camps closed, the idea that Asian people were stupid and evil would still be there, but it was there. It was there in the eyes of that kid on the bus. It was in his hateful stare and in his heart. I know now that that kid on the bus wasn't just angry or hateful. He was afraid of me because I looked different. And that fear is very old, very deep in our culture, but it's not set in stone. There are ways to fight back against that fear through writing, activism, even just calling it out. And even though this terrible thing has already happened to the Japanese, the Chinese, my ancestors, and me, we can stop it from happening again. It doesn't matter if you're black, white, Japanese, Chinese, Muslim. If we stand together, not as a race, not as groups or ethnicities, but as people, we don't have to be afraid anymore.